Hello students, today we will be talking about a new concept in international relations called national interest. We would basically discuss this concept in this way. First we will talk about the background of the whole concept of national interest, then we will be talking about the meaning of the term, what is generally understood as national interest. Third, we will be talking of different approaches used to understand national interest. So, let us start our discussion with the background of the whole concept of national interest. In international relations, there is a saying that there are no permanent enemies or no permanent friends, only thing permanent is a country's national interest. Although you can give credit for this statement to Lord Palmerston of the United Kingdom, but most leaders in the world, they are either leaders, they are either statesmen, they have invoked this concept of national interest more than one time to justify their policies and actions, and sometimes used it as a kind of tool to criticize other policies and actions. Although scholars trace the history of the concept of national interest to the evolution of the nation state system, starting with the Treaties of Westphalia, it was much older than generally it is understood. In the ancient period, in the medieval period, kings and kingdoms, they also secured the interest of their territories and subjects. That shows that our understanding of national interest is not very much related to the Treaties of Westphalia. Rather, it was widely understood, widely used by the kings and the kingdoms to talk about the interest of their citizens, interest of their subjects and interest of their territories. National interest is, however, identified with the nation state because we are talking of the nation, and this concept of nation was earlier absent, and that is why it is considered as one of the most interesting and crucial concept in international relations. As the overriding purpose governing the state's relationship with the outside world, it serves two main purposes. First, it gives a general orientation towards the external environment. So, when you think of the external world, when you think of the boundary outside your state boundary, so basically it guides you, it gives you a general orientation. Here it serves as a radar. So, as the radar shows the path, so similarly national interest can be used as a radar, or that gives a kind of orientation to the leaders what they have to do on the policies dealing with the outside world. Most importantly, it also serves as a controlling criteria of choices in immediate situations. So, you have different choices for different contingencies, but when you think of national interest, it gives a kind of control, or it controls your choices. You look at the choices from the perspective of national interest, what is good for your country, what is not good for your country, what is beneficial for your people, what is not beneficial for the people. So, in that way national interest serves as a kind of restricting concept, or a kind of controlling concept that makes you to define, that makes you to distinguish what is right, what is wrong for your country. The dominant view of national interest, in other words, dictates the nature of a state's long-term effort in foreign policy and governs what it does in this short-term context. So, in both the long-term perspective and for the short-term perspective, you need a concept, you need a guiding principle that will help you to decide what is to be done, what is not to be done, both for short-term and long-term purposes. National interest also adds an element of consistency in a nation's foreign policy. A country carefully sticking to its national interest in a swiftly changing situation is more likely to maintain its balance and continue to advance its foreign policy objectives. So, in a way it helps you to maintain a kind of consistency to your policy, because you know that what you have to do, what you have not to do, and in a situation if there are lots of changes in the world, there are lots of challenging situations in the world, it is national interest that will guide you to come out or overcome from those problems. So, in that way it is helping you to maintain a kind of balance, or you maintain a kind of consistency in your foreign policy. Now, let us discuss about the meaning of national interest. Of all the concepts in international relations, national interest is the most vague and therefore easily used, misused and even abused, particularly by the politicians in the name of national interest. So whenever you look at the concept of national interest, it is basically very loosely used, sometimes abused, sometimes misused, because anything you can do with your own people, you can justify that in the name of national interest, even if it is against the interest of those people. We have so many historical examples. Mao killed a lot of Chinese during the Cultural Revolution in China, but he justified that in the name of national interest. Indira Gandhi imposed internal emergency, but she justified that in the name of national interest. America did a lot of wrong things. Similarly, many authoritarian and totalitarian countries, they do a lot of wrong things with their own people, but they also do that or justify that in the name of national interest. So, in that way, national interest is a concept that can easily be manipulated, that can easily be abused, that can also easily be misused. And so, you can do a lot of injustices with your own people in the name of national interest. However, to claim that a particular foreign policy is in the national interest imparts a kind of authority and legitimacy to that policy. But despite the political reasons, national interest as a scientific concept, as an analytical tool, can be used to understand to a kind of authority and legitimacy that adds to a country's foreign policy. So, when you say it is in our national interest to do that, so in that way you add legitimacy to your policy, you add a kind of authority to that policy. Although the concept attracted a lot of scholarly attention, particularly after the Second World War, with the beginning of the Cold War or the ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it is no longer the case today, because most of the countries are now talking of national interest, because there is an expansion of the international society. Many countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, they are all newly independent countries, and everybody as a country, as a nation state is concerned about its national interest, is concerned about its people, is concerned about its goals. So, that is why it is not just restricted to the superpowers, it is not just restricted to the United States, rather all the countries give equal kind of priority to the concept of national interest. Still, this is not a concept we can just dismiss as mere rhetoric, because without an accepted notion of national interest, those who are called upon to evaluate their leaders' performance have no helpful criteria to do so. The point is, we can't simply reject the concept, because if you look at the analytical potential of this concept, this can be used to evaluate what the leaders do for your country, what the leaders do for your population. So in that way, it can be used as an evaluative criteria to judge your leaders' performance or the performance of your decision makers. Frankel divides various attempts to define national interest into two broad categories. One is called the objective category and the second is called the subjective category. The first category embraces those approaches that view national interest as a concept that can be defined and examined with some objective criteria. So, basically those who think of national interest as a concept, so they take the help of some objective criteria to understand what this concept is all about and how we can understand this as a concept like any other concept, such as ideology, balance of power or collective security, and so many concepts. So, one approach is to understand the concept of national interest as a concept, as a scientific tool to understand, evaluate and judge the foreign policy of your country, the foreign policy of your leaders and decision makers. The second category contains those definitions which seek to interpret national interest as a constantly changing pluralistic set of subjective references like ideals versus interest, short term versus long term concerns, and general versus specific concerns. So, if you think of national interest as a kind of subjective references like what are your ideals, what are your interest, what are your short terms and long term concerns, what are your particular concerns, what are your general concerns. So, in that way it can be understood in a very subjective way. So, you can understand national interest as a concept in a very objective way, and you can also understand national interest in a subjective way by focusing on the various kinds of interest the countries are associated with, or they emphasize those kind of interest that may be their permanent interest, that may be their temporary interest. So you can understand national interest both as a both in the subjective and objective angles. The concept is usually used in two interrelated ways. On the one hand, the word interest implies the need that by some standard of justification attain in the status of an acceptable claim on behalf of the state. So, in a way it is used as a kind of acceptable claim, that once you say something that adds a kind of legitimacy, that is used as an acceptable claim on behalf of the state, that you are saying something that represents the interest of that country, that represent the interest of that nation. When you say India wants a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, that means India is interested, or India's claim is acceptable as the claim of the population of India, not just the government of India. So, when the government of India is saying something, it means it is saying something about the country, about the people of India, that India being the largest democratic country in the world, being the most populous country in the world, it has a legitimate claim or an acceptable claim for getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So, seen in this perspective, national interest is considered something as an acceptable claim on behalf of the state. On the other hand, national interest is also used to describe and support particular policies. So, when the government does something, when India decided to import petroleum from Russia, when India decided to have better engagement with America, these kind of policies are justified in the name of national interest, that your policy demands increasing import of petroleum, natural gas and other things from Russia. So, you are not bothered about the international sanctions, or not just the international sanctions, they were all Western sanctions. So, Western countries, they have different interest in imposing sanctions against Russia. You have different interest in importing petroleum for your country, because you need your economic growth to continue, you need to bring a lot of people out of poverty, you need your economic prosperity. So, because of all these reasons, you decided to continue the traditional relationship with Russia, the friendly relationship with Russia, and imported those things like petroleum, like gas from Russia, because that serves your interest. So, in that way national interest can be used and understood in both ways, as an acceptable claim of a particular country, and justifying the policies of the government in the name of national interest. Problem in deciding the criteria that can establish a correspondence between the national interest expressed as a principle and the policies by which it is advanced. So, if you mix up national interest as a principle with a kind of framework that advances your country's foreign policy, then there may be some problem, because sometimes the principle may be opposed to the framework, and the framework may be opposed to the principle. If you stick to the principle, then that may create problem for you. Sometimes for example, you as a democratic country, you want more and more countries to be democratic, to follow human rights, to obey human rights, but that may be your principle, but sometimes it may create problem for your interest. For example, if you stick to democracy, if you stick to human rights, if you interfere in those issues, if you pressurize other countries to do that, they may be problematic for your interest. India's case with Myanmar is the best example, you know. So India is a democracy, and it is not happy with the Myanmar government for you know, suppressing the democratic elements, but as a democratic country, India is definitely interested for Myanmar to restore democracy, but you know, the China factor is there. So you know, so your principle of democracy or your principle of promoting and advocating democracy may come in the way of your, you know, national interest, because you know, because of, you know, Chinese presence in Myanmar. So Myanmar may create problem for India, and India may face a lot of problems in the northeast, maybe because of terrorism, maybe you know, drug, you know, peddling, maybe proliferation of small weapons. So the problem is, you know, if you consider the principle, if you think of, you know, your interest, you know, sometimes the principle may clash with the framework, and the framework may clash with your, you know, principle. In formal terms, one can identify two attributes of such policies. So you know, we can overcome this kind of dilemma if we focus on two attributes. The first attribute is basically based on inclusiveness, whether you are you know, representing the interest of all the groups within the country. So you know, that is one way of, you know, judging national interest, that whether it is representing a section of the society or it is representing the whole population. So that kind of inclusiveness will help us to understand whether you are talking of national interest or you are talking of sectional interest. The second is your policy of exclusiveness. You know, when you you know, you formulate any policy, you are not concerned about, you know, other groups living outside your country. Sometimes it may happen that you are formulating a policy that may be, you know, beneficial for your diaspora, for your population living outside the country. You know, leaving apart that, you know, most of the time, you know, you are talking of, or you are focusing on the groups, on the people and the communities living within your border. So basically, this principle of inclusivity and exclusivity, you know, that helps us to better understand the concept of international relations. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We started with the saying that there are no permanent enemies or no permanent friends, only permanent interests, reflecting the pragmatic approach nations take in international relations, a perspective that acknowledges that geopolitical dynamics can shift, requiring countries to adapt their foreign policies to align with changing global circumstances and opportunities. We have discussed the case of India and America in the Cold War period, and Pakistan and America in the Cold War period. How the relationship between India and, you know, United States changed in the post Cold War period, and how the relationship between the United States and Pakistan got bitter in the post Cold War period. National interest as a concept predates the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which marked the formal recognition of the modern state system. Throughout history, rulers and states have pursued policies aimed at securing territory, resources, trade routes, and strategic advantages to enhance their power and influence in international relations. National interest accomplishes two goals. Firstly, it provides foreign policy with a broad orientation towards the outside world by defining the fundamental objectives and priorities that guide a country's interactions with other countries and international actors. This orientation helps the policymakers to identify and pursue strategic interests such as national security, economic prosperity, territorial integrity, and the promotion of ideological or cultural values on the global stage. Secondly, national interest gives coherence to a country's foreign policy by ensuring consistency and alignment across various diplomatic, economic, and military initiatives across different government agencies and branches, which is crucial for maintaining credibility in international relations, enhancing credibility for allies and adversaries alike and effectively leveraging a nation's resources and capabilities to achieve strategic foreign policy goals. Frankel divides attempt to define national interest into two broad categories. The first one is objective and the second is subjective. While objective definitions of national interest focus on tangible and measurable factors that are considered essential for the survival, security, and prosperity of a nation state, subjective definitions emphasize the perceptions, values, and aspirations that shape a nation's understanding of its interest. Frankel's categorization highlights the dual nature of defining national interest. While objective factors provide concrete foundations for policy decisions, subjective factors contribute to the interpretation and prioritization of those interests within the context of broader strategic goals and national identity. In the next lecture, we will discuss the broad approaches that link national interest to specific foreign policy goals. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you once again.